This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We are super duper glad to have you.
That we are.
And we are in for a lot of fun today. Now, to be kept up on what we're doing, feel free to follow us at Creep Street Podcast on Instagram, Creep Street Pod on Twitter. We also have a Facebook, and on our Facebook, we have a subgroup called Citizens of the Milky Way, where anyone can hop on there and just post memes, articles, ask questions, anything like that. We'll also post on there a few days early what our episode is going to be for that week.
Yes.
Just fun stuff like that. Once again, feel free to check that out. It's called Citizens of the Milky Way. So just go to Facebook and check out Citizens of the Milky Way.
And we have a TikTok.
We sure do. Feel free to check us out there at Creep Street Podcast.
That's a little something we've used kind of lightly, but starting in 2023, we're going to up our game.
Yeah. Big time.
And on YouTube as well. We got big things planned for this year, folks.
We're excited. Stay tuned. Now, if one episode a week is just not cutting it.
Oh, you should know by now it's not.
Yeah, it's just not. But you may also know that we've solved that problem.
Yes, we have.
It's over at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. There we have all sorts of bonus content for you. We've got movie reviews, movie commentaries, interviews, short stories, conversations, and full bonus episodes.
Oh, it's a sexy place to be.
I mean, it's sexy. Dylan, I'm glad you said it because I was thinking it.
Yeah,
and it's sexy.
I mean, it's hot, baby.
Yeah.
It's hot.
You can check that out at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. So here we are. It's January.
That's right, baby.
So it's a little, up here in Chicago, it's a little dreary. And, I think we just need something to rattle our systems a little bit. Dylan, do you think this week's episode can do that for us?
This one is definitely gonna rattle you, folks.
Whoa, I'm excited. Okay, Dylan, what are we talking about today?
Folks, this is a freaky one.
Okay.
And it's going to be a two-parter, so part 2 will be coming next week.
Yes, buckle up, buttercups.
And this is, it's a scary one, folks. Get ready for a haunted house tale. This week we are covering The House That Screamed, Volume 1. Now, how's that for a title?
Wow, The House That Screamed.
Yes. Now, the house is usually called the Screaming House. I went with The House That Screamed. I don't know. I just thought it kind of had a cool ring to it.
Yeah, just switch it up. Why not?
The Screaming House is awesome, too, but, The House That Screamed kind of has, an old black and white horror film sound. Reminds me of, an old Vincent Price movie or something.
Oh, spooky. So, we can expect some scares.
Yes.
Okay.
Some bumps in the night.
Okay. I'm listening. I'm paying attention.
And let me tell you my source, a book written by the man who experienced it himself. It is called The Uninvited, The True Story of the Union Screaming House by Steven LaChance.
Okay, yes, Mr. LaChance.
Now, just so everyone knows, I'm pretty sure, now his name is the same, and I think his kids' names are the same. I'm sure some of the other people, he changed names just to protect their. So in this book, for example, there's another family that's going to come in at the end of this part, and going in part 2. I think I've heard some of their names said differently. I think maybe they changed. But for this sake, I'll go with what's written in the book.
Yeah.
It's still freaky as hell.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, this is a scary one, folks. And the location for our story is the tiny town of Union, Missouri.
Okay.
My source describes it as a small town about 50 miles southwest of St. Louis in Franklin County. It's definitely what you would consider a small, kind of rural community. It's composed mostly of working and middle-class families that have kind of grown up there, a lot of generations on top of generations. The man at the center of our story is none other than Steven LaChance, who also authored the book that I used as my main source. Here's a bit of backstory on the LaChance family. Steven was born on January 3rd, 1965 in St. Louis to devout Lutheran parents. He spent his early years living in the North St. Louis suburbs. And at age 11, Steven and his parents moved to the country, moved out there to live. They lived right between two small towns, one called Washington and the other Union. Union will be the location for much of our tale, and, well, this is where Steven would grow up, having a happy childhood. After high school, he went to college, where he did well with grades and everything, and even became a national champion on the debate team.
Oh, very cool.
At age 23, Steven got married, and shortly after that, they had their first child, a daughter named Lydia. A year and 6 days after that, they had their second child, Michael. And then 18 months after that, in January of 1991, they had their third child, a son named Matthew. So Lydia, Michael, Matthew, those are the kids.
What a squad.
Life seemed to be going splendidly. Until about 4 years after Matthew was born, when Steven came home one day to find his wife waiting for him there. She told him she was leaving him.
Oh, no.
As she described it, she didn't want a divorce from him, but from the children.
Oh.
I guess she had never wanted to be a mother and just couldn't do it anymore. In fact, here's some dialogue from the book that she apparently said. "It's not that I want to divorce you, I want to divorce the children. Damn it, Steven, I never wanted to be a mother. I did that for you. You always knew you wanted to be a father. It was and is just not for me. I can't do it. I try, but I just can't seem to do it. This is the right thing. This is the most right thing that I can do for them and for you. It's me. It isn't you, and it isn't them. This is about me. You have until Friday for you and the kids to find someplace to live. I haven't paid the rent in 6 months. Tomorrow, they're turning off the electricity."
Oh, my God.
So there's also that little ditty at the end there. Now, let's keep in mind, we're just going to, because of the sake of the story, we don't know. I don't even think he named his wife, his ex-wife. Who knows her side of the story? Maybe it's not as black and white as it seems.
Right.
Yeah, you know what I mean? If that's how it happened, truthfully, that is awful.
Oh, God.
But, who knows? I don't want to, like we said, we don't know her name, so we aren't, if that's really what happened, that's pretty fucked up, very fucked up. Just kind of sad.
Yeah, very sad. And that they got to move at the end of the week? That is oh my God.
I guess she had been taking the money that was meant for rent and spending it on other things. So yeah. She clearly, if that's what happened, she clearly just kind of went off the deep end.
Yikes.
She apparently even said that she had considered abandoning the children at the grocery store.
What the hell?
I know, but she figured, someone would have just found them anyway. It's weird. And she clearly, if this is really what happened, she clearly was having some sort of a breakdown.
Yeah. You can't just abandon your kids at a grocery store.
It just sounds,
you're going to go to jail.
Just leave the husband and the children if it's that
bad. What are you talking about?
If this is as Steven says it went, it sounds like it's some sort of a mental collapse, really.
Yeah.
Well, for the next 6 months, Steven and the children moved in with his parents until they could get their feet on the ground and get a place of their own. Over the next few years, his wife would visit the children less and less And likewise, the children had less and less desire to even see her.
Well, I mean, yeah.
And 2 years prior to his wife leaving, Steven had been dealt a huge blow when his older sister Janice suddenly died. The book doesn't go into detail, but she apparently just laid down for a nap one day and never got back up.
Oh my God.
This was devastating to Steven, as he and his sister were very close, and it also changed Steven's relationship with a higher power. Before her death, I don't know how devout he was, but maybe he was casually so. But after her death, he said he felt anger toward God and even denied there was one at all. Steven says he believes it was this anger in his heart that sort of opened the doorway for all that would follow in the years to come.
Yeah, interesting. We've heard that before.
Yeah. What's interesting is that about a year after his sister's death, Lydia came to Steven one morning, his daughter, saying that she saw Aunt Jan in her closet and that she was wearing a pretty yellow dress. When Steven told Lydia she had only been dreaming, she was adamant that she had seen her, saying, "No, Daddy, she was there. She was in my closet. She told me to keep it a secret because you wouldn't understand."
Wow.
Sad, very sad.
Yeah, so who knows what that was?
So as the years went on, Steven and the children move around from apartment to apartment, house to house. It was actually at one of these apartments, before the house that we're going to be talking about, that Steven says he may have actually had his first paranormal experience.
Oh.
One that he didn't realize at the time, but after everything he would experience in the years to come, he looks back on it and goes, maybe that was my first encounter.
Right.
One night, while the kids were staying with his parents, Steven got out of the shower and walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and he stopped in his tracks as he entered the kitchen and found every cabinet door sitting wide open. And he remembered being told that the woman who lived there prior to them had died in the kitchen, and it was 4 days until her body was found.
Wow.
Just a kind of, it has nothing to do with the story ahead. It was just kind of an interesting thing that he looked back on later and was like, I wonder if that was my first encounter.
I mean, it sounds like it. That's like a horror movie.
Yeah, exactly.
That all the cabinets are just open.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's so weird.
Very weird. Of course, they move again a time or two more, and always there's something about the place that sucked, whether it was the landlords or the neighbors. But a plus side was Steven had recently gotten a new job that paid like double what he was already making. The unfortunate part was that he was also now often on the road for work. And while the kids always had their grandparents to stay with, they really took it hard when Dad had to go.
Yeah.
Especially the youngest child, Matthew. But with the new money, Steven was now able to give his kids more than just the necessities, like shelter, food, but now he was able to actually treat them. He got them video game consoles, they could go to theme parks, eat at restaurants, happy stuff, happy stuff. This was when what seemed like the house of their dreams came into their lives. When perusing the paper one day, Steven was excited to find a listing that seemed absolutely perfect for what they needed. It read as such: 3-bedroom house for rent in Union, full in-town living, near most schools and the city park, perfect for families, a full country kitchen with up-to-date amenities, large living and dining area with original woodwork intact, 2 bathrooms with mudroom, full basement with fruit cellar attached, large front porch and backyard perfect for children, the right house at the right price for the right family. If interested, please contact. Well,
I mean, it sounds good.
Well, Steven was very excited about the possibility of getting this house, but he felt that despite even the new money he was now making, the place just sounded so nice, he figured it was probably going to be out of their price range.
I mean, come on, it's got it all.
Regardless, Steven put in a call to the contact that was listed, and the following night his phone rang, and he chatted with the landlord on the phone. The place was sounding more and more perfect, which made Steven even more and more sure they wouldn't be able to afford it. That's why he was shocked when the man told him that rent was only $600 a month.
That makes me want to throw up.
Right, surely the place must actually be a dump then, he thought to himself, but the man invited him to an open house the next day to see it in person. So the next day, the boys went to their grandparents, and Steven and his daughter Lydia went to the open house. Pulling up to the property, it was clear the place was not a dump at all. Now they were worried that since it was an open house, they would be competing with a bunch of other people. Fortunately, they had made a point to arrive early and were the first ones there. The landlord hadn't even arrived yet. Just the maintenance man was there. So waiting for the landlord, the maintenance man showed them around, and they loved the place. He even noticed in the basement there was what is called a butcher's shower. that was still there and still operating. I guess it was a thing butchers used to rinse themselves off.
That's gross, but cool.
I guess so, right. But keep that in mind.
Oh, no.
When the landlord did arrive, he was a very eccentric man named Carl Winters. And like I said, maybe his name's not actually Carl Winters. Who knows? Who
could know?
He showed them around the place. He said he was very eccentric. He had like a wig that was clearly fake, that was always falling off.
We love.
He would wear, it's hot and humid there in Missouri in this time of year. He would always wear like big wool coats. He's just a wacky older guy.
Yeah.
But anyway, he showed him around, and the first thing they noticed was the way he was showing off the place was more like how one would give a tour in a museum rather than showing a house. They were determined to get the place and were the first to even fill out an application. And in the days ahead, they would wait excitedly to hear back.
Very cool.
Well, the very next night, after having visited this potential new home, Steven was suddenly awakened by the sound of his youngest son, Matthew, screaming. A few moments later, he heard the sound of his son's footsteps running down the hall to his room. Matthew came in a panic and turned on the lights. Not even able to catch his breath, he said, Daddy, he was in my room. He was in my room. When Steven asked who was in his room, the boy could only say, a man. Steven walked with Matthew back to his room, and there was no one in there except his other son, Michael, who was sharing a room with Matthew. Steven tried to calm Matthew down, saying he had just had a nightmare and that everything was okay. Matthew pointed to an empty corner of the room where he claimed that he saw the man. After checking the closet, the bathroom, finding nothing, Matthew was still adamant that he had seen someone and that it wasn't a dream. Well, dream or not, Matthew wanted to sleep in Steven's room that night. So Steven tucked him in and quickly went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. After having a drink, Steven made his way back down the hall to his bedroom, turning off the lights as he went. Right before entering his bedroom, Steven stopped to turn off the hallway light, looking back down the hallway, and he thought for a moment he saw something. It moved quickly. It seemed almost like the shadow of a man quickly ducking into the darkness. Instantly, Steven flipped the light back on, only to find the hallway empty. Thinking he was just sleepy, he chuckled to himself and went to bed.
Okay.
That same night, Steven would also have a nightmare.
Oh, fuck.
In fact, it came just after Steven had fallen asleep to the point he didn't even realize he had fallen asleep.
Oh, yeah.
Somewhere in the dark bedroom, Steven thought he heard what sounded like a raspy voice saying, "Look at me." Laying still in the darkness, he heard it again. "Look at me. See me." The room now seemed darker than normal, darker than dark. Steven propped himself up on an elbow, looking around the room in the darkness. He called out, "Who's there?" Silence. "Who's there?" Steven asked again. After a few quiet moments, Steven figured he had just heard something and laid back down to fall asleep. That's when he felt an intense pressure on his chest. It was like someone was pushing him down, pinning him to the bed. He couldn't move and he couldn't see anything because it was so dark. That's when he heard the voice again. "You know you want to look at me." And as it spoke, a putrid stench filled the room. "Look at me, for I am glorious." All Steven could manage to do was utter the words, "Please, God," to which the voice responded saying, "God isn't here. God doesn't exist. You've said so yourself, haven't you?" And then again it said, "Look at me." In utter terror, Steven could now see glowing white eyes in the dark. He briefly saw white ghostly hands before they wrapped around his throat. And that's when the voice said, "God isn't here. It's just me." And that's when Steven saw a hideous face in front of him. The only way he could describe it was a sort of blasphemous image of Christ. It was like Christ's face, but just not good.
Oh, God.
Screaming, Steven shot up in bed from his sleep, realizing it had just been an awful nightmare. But he wouldn't be able to sleep anymore that night.
Yeah, that is quite the nightmare.
Quite spooky, right?
The look at me thing.
Yeah, very freaky, right? The stench, all of that. The pinning him down in his bed, almost like sleep paralysis.
Yeah, all of it. I mean, and just saying like that God isn't here.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Very freaky. So the call the family had been hoping for came a week after visiting the house.
Hell yeah.
On the other end of the line was the eccentric landlord, Carl Winters, happily telling him that his family had been selected, and if they were still interested in the property, it was theirs. And of course, they were. Steven wanted to meet him that very evening at the house to sign the paperwork and get the keys, but Carl told him that some repainting was being done there tonight and tomorrow, and that it would be best to let them get that done first. So they agreed to meet the next day at a restaurant near where Steven worked. The next day comes, it's a Monday, and of course, Carl is late again, as he was to the open house. That's a thing, he's always late for some reason.
Oh no.
He gets out of his car holding his awful wig down to his head, dressed in his wool coat. They went in, they got a table, and to Steven's surprise, Carl actually ate a whole meal before they even started talking about the house.
Oh, wow.
Once he finished eating, they got down to business. Carl read to Steven the entire lease word for word. Steven signed and handed over the check for first and last month's rent, thinking now finally he would get the keys to the place. That's when Carl said, "Okay, let's meet at the place on Thursday at 2 p.m., where he would get an even more thorough tour of the place and that it would probably take a few hours."
What?
Steven was like, "Hey, I have to work, man. The earliest I could even get there is like 6 p.m. That's when Steven noticed Carl become visibly nervous and fidgety. He agreed to meet at 6 p.m. on Thursday, saying, "Well, I suppose that will have to do. I must leave there before dark, though. I do hate driving at night." Steven was, of course, thrilled to have finally signed the lease, but he was also a little worried that he had given Carl first and last month's rent and didn't even have keys yet. But even that wasn't what puzzled Steven the most. He kept thinking about what Carl had said about how he must leave there before dark because he didn't like to drive at night. Steven had a hunch that it didn't have anything to do with driving at night, but rather that Carl seemed to be afraid to be at that house after dark. Oh yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Thursday comes. Steven's there at the house at the time they agreed, but of course it was 6:31 when Carl showed up. They entered through the back door as the porch had just been painted and it was still wet because it had been humid there and the paint was taking a long time to dry. Starting on the first floor, they looked over every square inch of the place to make sure everything was in working order. They were making their way up to the second floor when Steven was kind of surprised when Carl asked him if he believed in ghosts. Steven said no and asked why he would ask. Carl responded with a strange response, saying, "Well, I haven't heard any such nonsense about this house having ghosts. However, not everyone can live in an old house such as this." But before Steven could even respond, Carl hurried him up the stairs, saying, "We had better hurry. Not too much daylight left."
Very weird.
Yeah.
Huh.
Together, they did a thorough look through the second floor and then came back downstairs. It was then that the ice maker in the kitchen refrigerator dropped a load of ice into its container with a bang, and this just mundane, everyday sound made Carl nearly jump out of his skin. He was like, "What was that?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. And when Steven told him it was just the ice maker in the fridge, Carl breathed a sigh of relief. With that, Carl handed Steven the keys and headed to the back door, saying, "I do wish I could stay and chat longer, but I must get home. I'll call you this weekend." And with that, he abruptly left. Steven just shrugged off the man's kooky behavior, feeling immense relief that the home was officially theirs. Switching off all the lights, Steven locked the door and got in his car. Tomorrow was going to be a big day. It was going to be moving day. And as he pulled out of the driveway and drove down the road, Steven didn't notice behind him that all the lights in his new house were turning back on one by one.
Oh, fuck. That's so weird.
Oh, yeah. Well, that night, the family finished up what was left of the packing. Steven was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately after he went to bed. And that night, he had another dream. In it, him and the kids had finally moved into their new home. Everything was so clean and fresh. There came a knock at the door, and Steven figured it was one of the new neighbors welcoming them to the neighborhood. He was shocked to open the door and see it was his ex-wife standing there.
Oh.
That's when the mood of the dream grew darker. What was a moment ago a beautiful day was now filled with dark, swirling storm clouds. His wife was holding something in her arms, and then she shoved the bundle into his arms, saying, "I told you I can't be a mother," and turned and ran away. In his arms, Steven found a baby with eyes that were an unnatural crystal blue color. Then his daughter Lydia came up to him and asked what it was. He responded saying, "It's a baby. It's our baby." And with that, Steven burst into tears. Waking up, he was also crying in real life. To this day, he has no idea what that dream meant. Perhaps this was a child that they would have had his ex not left. Who knows? But he says it still haunts him to this day.
Weird.
So next day, it's moving day, baby.
Woo!
And it was an exhausting day. They had finally gotten everything unloaded from the truck. They got everything loaded in, drove to the new place, and they're unloading it. And as they're bringing stuff in, a car drives by and slows down as it passes the house. And the person inside the car rolled down the window and politely called out to them saying, "Hope you get along here okay." And with that, the person just drove off without saying anything else. And they wondered to themselves what that was all about, but they just shrugged it off. But it was weird because it was almost like the person was wishing them luck with the house. The first night in the house was quiet, uneventful. They were all exhausted from moving everything that day, so they all slept that evening in the living room. Tomorrow they would eventually begin unpacking and making the house a home. The next day comes and they get right to work. And the first thing that they noticed that was kind of strange was on all of the doors, almost all the doors in the house, there had been installed those old school hook, and there's a loop and a hook that was like an old school way to lock the door. The little, looks like a fish hook, you flip it over and it.
Right.
Well, almost every door in the house had one of those installed, which, hey, it's an older house, that's normal. Some houses still have them.
Yeah.
But what was weird about how they were installed was that they were all installed on the outside of the doors. Usually, locks are installed on the inside of the door so the person in the room can have privacy.
Right.
The way they were installed seemed almost like they were meant to keep something locked inside.
That's fucking weird.
Yeah. There were other odd things they noticed while unpacking on that first full day as well. There was a portrait of two angels that Lydia really loved and wanted to have it hanging in the living room. So Steven hung it up, but every time he turned around, the picture would have fallen back to the ground. The third time Steven turns away, he said he felt like what was a rush of air, and the picture then once again fell and hit the back of his feet.
What?
He had to hang it up 4 times.
So weird.
But that wasn't all. Despite it being hot and humid, the house was somehow very cool. They figured it was just the air conditioning working overtime, and the landlord, Carl, had said that there was new insulation installed, so perhaps it was just that. While they're going about unpacking, the kids come and they get Steven wanting to show him something. They took him to the front of the house and showed him how every person who walked down the street would cross to the other side of the street rather than pass in front of the house. Without fail, it kept happening. They even tried to give a friendly wave to one of the passersby, and they just kind of looked at the ground and hurried off.
Uh-oh.
That evening, Steven set up Lydia's bed in her room, and that evening, Steven and the boys would once again sleep in the living room, and he would set up the rest of the beds the following day. Sometime during the middle of the night, Steven saw Lydia come lay down in the living room where they all were, and he asked why she wasn't sleeping in her new room. She had been so excited about it. She told her dad that the closet door kept opening, and it sounded like boxes in one of the other rooms were getting moved around. She said it scared her and she just wanted to stay in the living room with them. Well, the next day was Sunday, and in the morning, the grandparents stopped by to pick up the kids for church. Steven had, of course, avoided church since his sister's death, but this was a chance for him to have a little alone time while the kids were gone and grab a quick nap. Laying down on the living room couch, Steven was briefly startled by the sound of a box falling upstairs in one of the upstairs rooms. But he brushed it off, figuring one of the kids had just been rummaging through the boxes and it was just kind of set off balance and it just tumbled. He quickly falls asleep for a nap. And the next thing he knew, he was waking up as the kids were coming home. They were happy to get out of their church clothes and into comfy clothes and do some more work around the house. It was a beautiful day outside, so they figured, hey, why don't we do some work in the yard? So they did some mowing, they trimmed, and the boys noticed that the grass looked pretty dry, so Steven tells Michael and Matthew to go down to the basement and get the garden hose. So they go in, and a few minutes later, Michael comes back. And Steven asks where Matthew is, and he's like, oh, well, he should have been right behind me. I guess he didn't even realize he hadn't been right behind him. That's when they heard the sound of Matthew screaming somewhere in the house. Steven goes running inside and finds Matthew standing in the kitchen in absolute terror, screaming, pointing at something. When he asked Matthew what was wrong, all he could manage to say was, Monster.
Oh, God.
Monster in the basement.
Oh, God.
And when they asked further, Matthew explained that there was a monster in the basement and that it had chased him up the stairs. Once they were able to get Matthew to calm down, Steven went to the basement. Of course, no one's there. He often in the book will do this. Before he realized it himself, he would kind of do this thing like you probably would with kids.
Yeah.
He would take him to every spot of the house, say, look, no monster in here. You know, just things you would do for a kid, you know. Well, Matthew was able to shake it off, and they ended up having a great day for the rest of the day. And they just continued the whole unpacking process. As evening came, Steven was too exhausted to cook, so they all got in the car and went to Taco Bell.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like my kind of family.
I was just going to say that. Dylan's kind of squad.
Give me a cheesy gordita crunch, baby. They're gone for barely an hour, and when they come back home, they find every light in the house turned on. Once again, Steven hadn't really made a point of making sure every light was turned off when they left, but he assumed that they had. It was just, even though kids do leave things on, he had always felt like he had done a good job of teaching the kids to turn off a light when they didn't need it.
Yeah.
But he assumed the kids had just done it, and he just didn't notice it when they left, you know. Well, when they walked inside, they realized how frigid cold the place was. But they brushed that off as well.
Okay, go on.
And the night goes on. The three kids were in the living room watching a movie. Matthew was in there as well, playing his Game Boy. Steven was in the family room, folding laundry. And Matthew walks by as he's walking to the bathroom, and he passes by the family room, and he just says, "Hi, Dad," as he's going to the bathroom. A few moments pass, and that's when suddenly everyone heard Matthew scream again. Steven happened to step out in the hallway right as Matthew was running by, and he grabbed him, and he's like, "Matthew, what is wrong?" Matthew is trembling, and he's like, "It came after me again." Once he was able to catch his breath, he tried to explain what had happened. Matthew said he went to the bathroom, but he left the door open so he could see what everyone was doing. He said he saw the monster standing at the top of the stairs, and that it charged down the stairs after him. And Steven is like, What came after you? And what Matthew said next sent a shiver down Steven's spine. He said, a monster clown came after me.
Oh, God. A monster clown.
Wow.
I mean, shout out to our Phantom Clowns episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking that too when I noted that in the source, yeah.
Yeah.
Later that night, after everyone went to bed, Steven laid in his bed awake, wondering what could be going on with Matthew. Was this maybe emotional trauma from the divorce? Like, now that he was getting older and able to express himself more, was it just something like about that kids, who knows, you know what I mean? That's when a sleepy Lydia entered his room saying that her closet door just kept opening and opening again. So once again, they all just slept in the same room. The kids drifted off to sleep, and shortly after, Steven finally did too. Later on, during the night, Steven was awakened from his sleep by a noise. Sitting up in bed, he rubbed his eyes and was surprised to see what looked like an old man in a red flannel shirt standing in the bedroom doorway.
Oh, God.
He stood there motionless, just staring at him and the kids. And once again, Steven rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. Steven just kind of chuckled, assuming that he was half asleep, groggy, and probably the kids being freaked out just had him seeing things. So he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. The following day was Monday, so the kids went to school, and Steven worked, and later that evening picked the kids up from his grandparents, and they drove home. Once again, when they arrive home, every light in the house is on. Steven thought that was weird because he could have sworn every light was off when they left that morning. But Steven would grow even more curious about the strange electrical stuff later that night.
Oh.
Later that evening, he was walking into the living room when he felt what seemed like an electrical shock running through his body, but it was different though. This wasn't like how, when you walk across a carpet with socks and then you touch a doorknob or you touch someone out and you get that little pop. It wasn't like that. It seemed to almost start deep within his body and work its way out. Every hair on his body seemed to stand up, and he suddenly felt an odd sensation of warmth. In an instant, the feeling was gone, and instead of the warmth, he felt an icy chill. Steven wondered if perhaps there was some kind of weird electrical issue going on, and he made a note to remember that to tell his dad about it the next day. The next day was much like the day prior. The kids went to school, Steven worked, and when he brought them home from their grandparents, once again, every light in the house is on.
I mean, what the hell?
This time, Steven felt panicked, though, because that morning, he made sure every light was off and even had Lydia with him as a witness. She walked around the house with him. He was like, I just want to make sure a second pair of eyes sees this.
Right.
So before letting the kids go in the house, Steven went through every room just to make sure there was no one there.
Yeah.
Of course, no one's there, but maybe had someone come during the day while they were gone. Nothing appeared stolen or out of place. So Steven picks up the phone and he calls the landlord, Carl Winters, and Carl assures him that he had not been there and that, by law, he needs to give them at least a 24-hour notice before he even can step foot in the place. Mm-hmm. But he did offer to have an electrician come out, but Steven declined as he was going to have his dad look at it first. So the next day, Steven's dad comes over. They go down to the basement where the circuit breaker box is and everything. And everything seems to be in working order. And of course, they notice again the butcher shower, which they thought was weird, Well, they went back upstairs and they're sitting in the living room chatting. They're mid-conversation when once again, in the room above them, they hear a boom, just like as if a heavy box had fallen over. Steven's dad kind of jumped and was like, whoa, what was that? And just as Steven was about to explain it to him and explain that it was probably just a box that hadn't been unpacked yet, he looked over to notice tears in his dad's eyes. He had an arm extended out and was looking at it in amazement. And he said, what is that? Steven knew right away that his dad was experiencing whatever weird electrical sensation that he had felt the night before. Shortly after, Grandpa got up, kissed the grandkids goodbye, and said that he would get home to mow the lawn. Seemed like he was kind of wanting to get out of there. And that he and Grandma would be by in the morning to get the kids for church. Steven watched as his dad drove away and wondered why his dad seemed to be so affected by that sensation. The next day, it's Sunday, the kids went to church with the grandparents, but then afterwards, they all went to the grandparents for a little BBQ. It was summertime now, the kids were just out of school, so they're over there, and the boys are outside playing, Grandma and Lydia are inside doing some other stuff, and Grandpa's at the grill. And standing there, he says, hey, Steven, come over here. I want to ask you something in private, something he didn't want to ask in front of the kids. So Steven thought that was a little weird, but whatever. He could tell that his dad kind of felt uncomfortable asking what he was going to ask. And he prefaced his question with saying, I don't really believe in this sort of thing, but do you think you may have rented a haunted house?
Oh.
Steven just kind of chuckled and said he's sure that there was a reasonable explanation for the electricity thing, and his dad agreed, saying that maybe it had something to do with the power lines that were above the house. Maybe, who knows, maybe they were hanging too low. Maybe that was just some weird, runoff current or something they had felt or something, Who knows? Of course, that night, when they returned home from their grandparents, all the lights in the house are on. They get out of the car and go to the front door, and just as Steven is about to unlock the door, he could have sworn he saw something in the corner of his eye. He almost thought he saw the figure of someone standing in the second floor window looking down at them as they entered. But of course, when he quickly looked back, there was no one there. In his mind, he's like, great, now that my dad's asking if the place is haunted, I'm all creeped out, so of course I'm gonna see and feel things, because I'm freaked,
Right.
Regardless, the kids were freshly on summer vacay, so they were going to have fun that night to celebrate, because they didn't have school the next day.
Oh, yeah.
First thing they did was they all went to the kitchen to have some chocolate ice cream. They're sitting there, the four of them eating, and of course, once again, the sound of what seemed like a box falling upstairs fell. But by now, they were almost kind of just used to that. They hadn't thought it was a haunting or anything, but they were just kind of like, what, they just kind of barely gave it a second thought. Folks, Creep Street, this is when things begin to kick into high gear.
Oh, yikes. This is a scary story.
After ice cream, they all gathered in the family room to play some Monopoly. They get the boards set up, and they're in the middle of playing when Steven sees something in the corner of his eye. Looking up, Steven's heart dropped from his chest when he sees a dark, shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the family room. It was solid in form, but seemed to almost be made out of dark gray or black swirling smoke. Not even able to process what he's seeing, Steven just quietly looks back down at the Monopoly board, trying to convince himself that when he looked back, it would be gone, that he was just seeing things. But to his horror, the entity was still there when he looked back. Even more terrifying, the figure was now approaching the family. Slowly at first, but then picking up pace.
Oh no.
It moved to the center of the family room and then once again stopped where it stood. Though Steven couldn't see eyes, he felt like it had eyes on him. And he watched in horror, in silent horror, as the figure eventually almost seemed to melt away into the floor and was gone. Keep in mind, they're in the middle of a Monopoly game. The kids didn't see it.
Yeah.
So Steven's sitting there, frozen in silence, while the kids are still just, like, oh, you pass go. They're playing,
Right.
They're doing their thing.
Right.
And in his head, he's just manically just thinking of what the right thing to do next is. Obviously, he knew he had to get him and the kids out of there. Obviously.
Yeah.
But he also didn't want to cause a panic. So getting to his feet and his hands like shaking, Steven picked up the car keys and said, hey kids, let's go get some soda and go back to Grandma's. The boys were kind of caught up in the game and they were like, oh, do we have to? Because they wanted to play Monopoly.
Yeah.
But Lydia could tell her dad was shaking. And even though she didn't know what was going on, she knew something was up. So she kind of helped corral the boys like, yeah, guys, let's go. It'll be fun. Like, So they get everyone up and they get ready to leave. They walk out of the house and the kids are walking to the car. Steven turns around to lock the door. And I think the best way to explain what happened next is to just read it right from the source. I was locking the front door when a loud, painful, tortured, agonized scream came pouring out of the house. Our house. It was the voice of a man screaming in pain, and it was so loud that the neighborhood dogs began barking in response. Get in the car! Get in the car! I cried at the kids who were already out the door in a dead run to the car. Michael, leading the pack, jumped over the hood of the car, a move he later claimed he had learned from a James Bond movie. I was in a panic. I knew we had to get away from that old white house now. I started the car and the engine quickly came to life. The tires squealed as my shaking foot hit the gas pedal. We were safe. Then, Matthew's frightened voice came from the back seat. Daddy, the basement monster is standing in the upstairs window. I looked back, and there it was. The black form was standing in the window, watching us leave. Daddy, it's in the window! It's in the window! Hurry! Lydia urged fearfully as we rounded the corner and on to the road that would lead us to the safety of my parents' house.
Wow.
Now, Steven, obviously Steven had seen, there had been the noises, the electric, and he thought he saw like an old man, but he was like half asleep. This is the first time where he's like, shit, I see it. And for the first time, they were all seeing what Matthew had been seeing.
Right.
It seemed like Lydia could see, everyone could see it.
I wonder if how Matthew was seeing it was the same as how they were all seeing it.
And we'll get into that.
Oh, fuck.
We'll get into that. Well, that night they stayed at the grandparents'. Steven explained what he and the kids had just experienced, and the grandparents believed him immediately. They would stay there that night and in the morning return. So morning comes, and everyone gets in the car and heads over. Walking up to the house, Steven said it was like he could feel eyes on him from a window on the second floor. But of course, when he looked up, there's no one in the window. They walk inside and all was quiet and normal. The Monopoly game was still left right where they had left it when they rushed out the night before. And then boom, once again, there's the sound above them on the second floor that sounds like a box getting knocked over. They go up to the second floor, search every room. Of course, nothing there. After searching the second floor, they all come back down, and that's when the kids come running in saying they need to see something. And the kids led them out back to where there was an old shed, and this shed was old. It looked like it was almost even older than the house. The shed was filled with boxes on boxes on boxes of all sorts of things. Birth certificates, death certificates, pictures, photo albums, all stuff from families who had lived in the house prior. And it was more than just one family. It looked like a bunch of different families. But it was all stuff that families wouldn't leave behind.
Yeah, that's weird.
Photo albums, birth certificates, like shit you wouldn't leave behind.
Yeah, that's really weird.
It was time to call Carl Winters and get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, come on, Carl? What's going on?
Now, this phone call is weird. First, Steven calls Carl, and of course, Carl says the place is not haunted, and that all the stuff in the shed actually belonged to a former tenant that he had been trying to get a hold of to come pick up the stuff. But then right after hanging up, Carl calls Steven back almost immediately and says that some of the stuff may have also belonged to a man who lived there before them who he said was probably a drug dealer. Steven asked what his reasons were for thinking that the guy was a drug dealer, and he says, well, he just got up and left the place in the middle of the night and never came back. Maybe he was on the run from someone. And Steven's like, yeah, on the run, but not from cops or criminals.
Oh.
So I just love that this guy thought the guy was a drug dealer because he left in the middle. No, he left in the middle of the night because this place is fucking haunted.
Yeah, that's so weird that you just assume that means he's a drug dealer.
Exactly. So they end the phone call. Once again, Carl calls back immediately.
Carl.
And he said, well, the place isn't haunted, but, if they wanted, he could have a priest come out and bless the place. But he didn't want Carl sending out anyone else because who knows what Carl would consider a priest, for God's sake.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Right.
Carl's a bit of crazy. Who knows? It could have been just your traditional priest, but who knows who Carl is going to send out.
Carl, we don't know about Carl.
Yeah, exactly. Steven thought maybe they could just stay with his parents for a few days, just to sort of wrap their heads around what was going on, just get free of the house for a few days, not have to think about it. And that's the plan. So they're going, and as Steven is locking up to leave, the blinds behind the door window open, almost as if someone had opened it to look at him while he was locking the door. But of course, there's no one there, but he saw the blinds open. Steven's like, I'm just leaving.
Yeah.
Over the next few days, the kids stayed with their grandparents, and Steven actually had a business trip in Indianapolis. The trip was actually kind of a relief for Steven. One, because he knew that the kids were safe with the grandparents, and because he was busy at work, he could kind of take his mind off things, especially during the day. Now, at night when he was in his hotel room, he thought about it a lot, but he was away from it, which was nice.
Right,
he could
right.
kind of just be alone with his thoughts, not have to worry about taking care of the kids, so it was kind of a refreshing business trip. And also at that time, Steven's brother Josh, who lived in Seattle, was visiting the grandparents as well as his wife Rita. And he was very happy about that because he loved his brother Josh, and he didn't get to see him that often because he lived over on the West Coast. And so that was also kind of like a nice added, it just made things a little better, knowing his brother was there and everything. And of course, while Josh, his brother's there, he, of course, hears about all the weird stuff going on.
Oh, yeah.
So Steven comes back from the business trip, goes to the grandparents, and visits with his brother and everything. And finally, they've got to just go back home. I mean, what are they going to do? They got to go home eventually. So Steven and the kids get in the car, and terrified, they drive home. But that evening was actually very quiet, which was a relief. That night, though, Steven would have a vivid nightmare that was unlike anything he had experienced. It was a dream that will actually return to him a few times throughout the rest of our story. I will now read to you, verbatim, Steven's nightmare in his own words. It's dark. I'm standing on the basement steps. They're old, wooden, creaky, and worn. Flowered neon print wallpaper is peeling off the walls of the stairway. It's barely visible in the moonlight cast through the basement windows below. I grasp the handrail and steady myself, calming my nerves. I begin my slow descent into the moonlit darkness below. The stairs seem to go on forever. With each step, I hear a familiar creak that announces my progress. I hear water running, and I'm going to investigate its origin. A few steps more, and I see a candle burning. It gives off a warm, dim glow. There is an unattended lit candle in the basement. Dismissing the candle from my mind, my attention turns to the sound of the rushing water. And along with the water, I can hear breathing. It's the labored breathing of a man. He's excited, perhaps even sexually excited. I turn back to the candlelight. The old butcher shower is running. A man stands beneath it, showering by candlelight in the darkness of the basement. The water and the breathing echo throughout the basement. The man doesn't see me. I watch as he tries to cleanse himself, purify himself of a dark substance, scrubbing his already raw skin. His face is hidden by the shadows. His labored breathing becomes panicked, as does the pace of his scrubbing. He can't get clean. He turns. I can see his frontal torso in the light. It's blood. He's washing off blood. Is he looking at me? I can't tell in the dim candlelight, but I sense his evil eyes on me as he continues washing. The room begins to spin. The sound of his desperation matches the tempo of the rushing water. Still, the room spins, spins, spins. I can still feel his eyes on me. I can't breathe. Oh my God, I can't breathe.
Oh, God.
Steven then wakes up from his dream with a jolt. Of course, they had all slept in the same room again because no one wanted to be alone, especially after what they had all experienced while playing Monopoly the other night. All the kids were still asleep, so closing his eyes again, Steven fell asleep, knowing soon he would have to get the kids ready for church. The next thing Steven knew, he was awakened by the sound of a nearby lawnmower. Had he slept in? Looking at his clock, Steven realized it was 5:05 p.m. Somehow, him and the kids had been asleep for 17 hours. How did all of them sleep for 17 hours?
Oh, my God.
Well, they hurried and got up because obviously they had missed church, but they were also supposed to have dinner at the grandparents' that night. It was a delicious dinner of fried chicken, and reluctantly, they, of course, after the meal, had to return back home. And they hoped and prayed it would be a quiet night. The kids got settled in, and the boys in their room playing a video game, Lydia in her room reading a book. Steven felt able to finally let his guard down. He was relaxing in a chair in the family room. From the boys' room, he heard Lydia's voice telling them that she was going to read her book in their room with them. Probably just didn't want to be alone. Then Steven dozed off for a few minutes, but was awakened when the phone rang. He answered it, and it was his mom just checking in to see how everyone was doing. And that is when shit went wild.
Oh, no.
Once again, I'll read this next part verbatim. As we chatted, I heard the doors rattle. Not the outside doors, but the ones inside. I listened more closely. They rattled again. I yelled at the kids to quit playing games. Everything was fine, I told Mom, just the kids playing tricks. Again, the doors rattled, but this time a little bit harder. I scolded the kids, telling them to behave. Then, as before, the doors rattled harder. But this time, before I could say anything, Lydia's scared voice cut me off. Daddy, that's not us. I'm reading and the boys are asleep. The rattling grew louder, and as my daughter spoke, I felt the temperature in the house drop instantly. A bolt of electricity shot through my body, accompanied by a horrible stench. Then the screaming began. It started softly, then built to unbearable decibels. Through the noise, I heard the bedroom doors slam shut. I didn't understand what was going on, but at that moment I knew I had to get my kids who were closed off from me by the slamming of the doors. My mother was still on the phone, and by now she could hear the screaming. Come help us, Mom, please, come get us. As I dropped the receiver, the whole house began to shake as it came to life. Boom, boom, boom. The screaming continued, and through it all I could hear Lydia's screams. Daddy, Daddy, what's happening? I remembered that one of the 2 bedroom doors connected to the second floor where I had seen the peering eyes and the basement monster. If it was coming downstairs, I had to get my kids. In the seconds that had ticked by, the whole house had come alive with noise. The floor beneath me shook as I made my way to the opposite bedroom door. I could feel something behind me, and I knew I didn't want to turn around and look at it. Boom, more screaming. This time that of a child. Boom, screams, boom. I made it to my bedroom door, but it wouldn't open. I knew the door wasn't locked because the hook and eye lock were on my side of the door, and the hook was just dangling idly on the door jamb. By now, my own screams added to the cacophony. I threw myself against the door, but it didn't budge. Again and again, I pounded my body against the bedroom door, but it didn't move. God, please, please help me, I prayed loudly, and just that quickly, the door fell open. Michael took Matthew by the hand, and they ran out of the front door to the car. Lydia was in shock, and I couldn't get her to move. Thankfully, she eventually responded, and I was able to grab her hand and lead her through the open bedroom door. The door closest to the stairs slammed behind us. It was on our trail, and I couldn't let it reach us. I didn't turn around to see what was coming after us, but I could feel it closely on our heels. All the while, the house continued its macabre activities. Boom, screams, boom, screams. Lydia and I reached the front door and met the boys at the car. From the street and the relative safety of the car, we could still hear the house alive with its noise. I drove to the top of the hill, where I parked to wait for my parents. As we waited, we watched the house. Whatever was in the house was searching for us. We could see its blackness move from room to room, searching carefully, methodically. Oh my God, I realized. It was looking for us. Finally, we saw the thing melt away into the kitchen. It was gone, and the house stood silent. My right side was bruised and throbbing from throwing myself against the door. The boys were silent, shaking. Lydia softly cried. "Why us, Daddy? Why us?" she asked. "I don't know, baby. I just don't know." A knock on the driver's side car window made us all jump. It was my dad. He spoke quickly, frantically. "Is everyone okay? Is everyone all right?" Just the sight of him brought all my emotions to the front. "I think I'm losing my mind," I said to him, hoping he would reassure me that I was fine. "No, son, you aren't losing your mind. These things just happen sometimes," he said with his ever-steady hand on my shoulder. His assurance then turned into determination. "Let's go figure this out." And with that, we were on our way back to the house. The troops had arrived. Oh boy.
This is heating up.
Heating up indeed. So it's the grandparents, and it's Josh, the brother, and his wife, Rita. They all drove a few different cars. They had a few cars with them. They psych themselves up, and they go back to the house. The kids stayed in the car with Josh's wife, Rita, and Steven and his parents and brother slowly approached the house. All was quiet. Almost too quiet. Taking a deep breath, they entered the house. The cordless phone was still on the floor, right where Steven had dropped it earlier. His mother was starting to say, "It seems too quiet," when all of a sudden she stopped. Steven looked over and saw her face was ghostly pale, with tears streaming down her face. She was looking at her arms. "What is that?" she asked. She was feeling that strange electrical sensation that Steven and his dad had also felt. Steven told her that that was that electrical feeling they had described. And with that, his mom said, "My grandkids are not staying another night here." She went out to the car and drove them back to her place. Rita came inside with Josh, Steven, and Grandpa. And they stayed with Steven while he packed up the things they needed. As Steven is packing, they can hear noises and whispering coming from the boys' room on the second floor. Steven, his brother, and his father went upstairs to investigate while Rita stayed downstairs. Of course, the room was empty, but they were greeted by an awful smell. They came back downstairs and were then startled by the sound of what sounded like a young girl screaming. Everyone froze in their place, and that's when Steven heard breathing. A loud, deep breathing. Thinking at first that it was Rita, Steven was even further terrified when he realized that the breathing was not coming from her, but from between them. Someone they couldn't see was standing between them, breathing heavily. It was time to go. Rita and Grandpa went and got in the truck, and Josh, he stayed by Steven's side as he locked everything up. They're on the porch, and Steven is locking the door, and while outside the front door, there are these two big trees that kind of form like a canopy. That's when they heard a rustling in the trees above them. Both men froze where they stood, and Josh whispered in a panic to Steven, saying, "They're in the fucking trees." Both men peered up into the darkness, trying to see what was in the tree. And just then they saw a shadow drop down to a lower branch of the tree like it was trying to get a closer look. Both men screamed and took off running to the truck. Behind them, they heard the sound of something jumping from the tree, landing on the ground, and they heard it chasing after them.
Oh my God.
In blind terror, both men ran like mad and hopped in the truck. Putting it in gear, they slammed on the gas and didn't let up until they were back at the grandparents' house. That night, Steven would have that exact same dream again, where he finds the shadowy figure under the butcher's shower, scrubbing. The next day at 1 p.m., Steven met with Carl at the house, saying he had to leave. Carl completely understood. He had brought a woman with him named Lillian, who apparently was some sort of an empath or psychic or something. Because as they're going through the house, the woman stopped in her tracks and goes, "That must have been the electrical sensation that you mentioned." And he had not mentioned that to either her or Carl. She just knew about it. Steven was relieved when Carl told him that he actually had a cousin who was lined up to take over the lease starting in July. And Steven made sure that it was just an adult moving in, no one with kids. and Carl confirmed. In the meantime, Steven and the kids would stay at the grandparents until they were able to sign a lease on a duplex in town. Steven's dad would help him get the place all packed up to move, and once again, as they're packing, a loud boom comes from the second floor. Well, Steven went and stood at the bottom of the staircase that led to the second floor, and he was like, all right, we're leaving. You don't have to be a dick anymore. We're leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And after he says this, it stops. And all was quiet until they left, and Steven is thinking finally, now they could have peace, they could get away from this crap. As Steven and his dad were loading up the last of their stuff, Carl pulled up in the driveway, the landlord. He was meeting the new tenants that day to take a tour of the place, and right behind him another car pulled in, and it was the new tenants. To Steven's horror, a man and a woman got out of the car, and with them were 2 young children.
Yikes.
How could that bastard let more kids into this house? Steven thought their time in the haunted house was over, but really, it was just beginning. And that is where we will end Part 1, Volume 1 of The House That Screamed.
Wow, what a scary, freaking story.
I know, right? Freaky.
I mean, a lot of stuff going on, and this is only part 1. We're only halfway through.
Only halfway through it, and let me tell you something. It only gets darker and scarier from here, folks.
Oh, God, this is a eerie one. This is a banger already. I am excited. This is exciting stuff.
Absolutely. It's freaky, gang.
Yeah, Dylan, thank you so much for doing that fantastic research.
Of course.
Cannot wait for the next episode. It is going to be a delight. Now, Dylan.
Yeah.
Do you have something to say?
Yes, I do. Well, I got a list of names that make me fill the house with screams.
Okay.
Folks, the names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker, Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Buren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Jeong, the Ghoulish Gerd Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Scheer, and the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer.
Whoa! Thank you so much to our top-tier Patreon subscribers. We couldn't do this without you.
That's true.
And we are so grateful for you. And just, gosh darn it, keep up the good work.
That's right. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.